My name is Dale Matchek, and I'm the chair of the Econ program here at Northwood University. Welcome to our Freedom Seminar. I am pleased to invite this morning to speak to you on the subject of sound environmental policy. An expert in the field, Jason Hayes, who is the director of the Environmental Policy Initiative for the Mackinac Center for Public Policy. The Mackinac Center, if you don't know it, it's located right here in Midland, Michigan. It's one of the leading state-level think tanks in the United States, one of the oldest. And the Environmental Policy Initiative at the Mackinac Center focuses on improving the lives of Michigan's residents by first working to understand Michigan's unique natural features and promoting policies that balance the state's environmental health with economic vigor. Jason has spent almost 3 decades studying and working in environmental policy and energy policy. He first worked as a backcountry ranger in British Columbia, as a forester in British Columbia, and researched national parks management, grizzly bear biology, Calgary in Canada. He spent over a decade researching and communicating energy and environmental policy with the Canadian and American energy industry before moving to the Mackinac Center in 2016. He has a Master's of Environmental Science degree from the University of Calgary, Bachelor of Science in Natural Resource Conservation from the University of British Columbia, and a Technical Diploma in Renewable Resource Management from Selkirk College. And he is also adjunct professor here at Northwood University. So thank you, Jason Hayes, for being here.
All right, good morning to the people here in the room and to people out in the ether. Thank you for welcoming me. I'm guessing I have to speak into this microphone. I won't get to wander today, I normally do. But thank you for inviting me to speak on this topic here, 7 Principles of Sound Environmental Policy. As Dale just said, my name is Jason Hayes. I'm the Director of Environmental Policy at the Mackinac Center, and part of this discussion will look at how markets can help to protect our natural environment. Dale gave this slide away here, so I don't have to go over it quite as in-depth, but essentially the Mackinac Center is Midland-based, Michigan-focused. We're a free market think tank that tries to educate and provide policy solutions to policymakers, to students, to academics, whoever needs it, so that we can basically have, as much freedom, free markets as possible. And so again, the Environmental Policy Initiative, which I lead up, works, some of the guiding principles that we use is to balance environmental health and economic vigor, to look at and recognize some of Michigan's unique natural features, and then to make sure that citizens of the state and visitors and that have access to the natural resources that Michigan has. So the 7 principles idea is not mine. It came from Larry Reed, who was the first president of the Mackinac Center when it was first formed in 1987. So Larry came up with this as a speech he gave regularly. It was called 7 Principles of Sound Public Policy. And for the people that are madly scribbling notes, you don't necessarily have to, because I will share these slides if that helps. If you want to take notes, go right ahead. But Larry's 7 principles served as the template for what I was doing here with this one, 7 Principles of Sound Environmental Policy, and then the other publication, which I'll discuss later on today at 1 o'clock, 7 Principles of Sound Energy Policy. And so if you look out on the back table, you'll see copies of these. You're welcome to take them home if you want. Read them. They're a short, easy read. But Larry's idea really served as the template for this. And so just kind of, I'm not going to go through and read all of Larry's, because that would steal his speech and would not get to mine. But jumping right in, the first of the 7 principles for sound environmental policy is that environmental stewardship starts with individuals, not with politicians, not with bureaucracies, not with orders from some government office. And there's a video here. I recommend it. It's easy to find on YouTube. It's Milton Friedman speaking to Phil Donahue. For those who are too young to remember Phil Donahue, he had a daytime TV show. It's kind of like Oprah's show or something like that. He was quite popular back in the day, and so he was able to get people as famous as Milton Friedman on his show. He asked some questions of Mr. Friedman, and I won't show the video because apparently it'll have difficulty with the streaming version of this, so I'll just speak to it a little bit. But Phil Donahue asked Mr. Friedman some questions, and he said, basically, if you look at the inequities that exist in the world, the poverty, those sorts of things, Donahue then said, does that ever give you pause for a moment to think that maybe there's a problem with capitalism and freedom of choice and that sort of thing because of the inequities that can come about as a result of it? And Friedman's answer was interesting because he said, no, the world works on people meeting their own separate personal desires and needs. And so he went through and he explained this. He said things like Einstein's general theory of relativity did not come about as a result of some politician or a government agent telling him, Mr. Einstein, we need a theory of general relativity, so get to work on it. Einstein did it on his own without that government impetus. He also talked about Henry Ford creating the processes that we now use in all of our automobile manufacturing and several other types of manufacturing. He said he didn't create that because of some government order. So again, people do these things based on meeting their own separate individual needs. And so individuals, not bureaucracies, do the same thing when it comes to environmental management. Personal responsibility and incentives matter. I'm sure you guys have all heard this from either Dale Matchek or Alex Tokarev or others teaching. Incentives matter. They change the way that things happen. And the reality is that people don't need a pamphlet, a mandate, or a government permission to make choices that improve their own lives or the environment in which they live. And what we'll do is we'll look at examples of that. But even just driving in this morning, when I was pulling in and parking in the lot, just off to the side of the lot, I saw a sign that said, this area, there's a little wet area beside the parking lot, is part of a biodiversity area. So don't go in there, don't touch it. I'm pretty sure if I went and I talked to any of the physical plant people or any of the administrators here at the school, there was no government agent probably that came in and said, look, you need to set that area aside. It would have been the school deciding on its own, here's a low wet area, we want to set this aside. Now, I could be wrong. Perhaps there was a government agent that came in and did do that, but at a school like this that's coming up with new ideas and that sort of thing, you can guarantee that there are things like that going on because individuals come up with the idea, whether it's a student or a faculty or that sort of thing. But again, people don't need those mandates from the government to help improve their own lives or the environment in which they live. And so I'll skip the video. Another example of this, private conservation groups working with farmers. There's a program put out by the Nature Conservancy called Bid for Birds, and another one that they've done. But basically what this one did is TNC helped to create a smartphone app. So you can use your phone as you're moving around your daily life and you can track people who are birders do this sort of thing. If you're interested in watching bird avians out there, then you can say, look, I open up the app and I saw this bird species in this area on this day at this time. And what that allows people who made the app to do is track the movement of different species as they migrate. These shorebirds, these wading birds, were migrating through California, and because of the use of the land, agricultural use and that sort of thing, a lot of the wading areas that they needed had been drained. And so what TNC did is they came up with an idea. They said, what's a large open area that tends to be flat, tends to be flooded? Where could we find something like this? And they went to rice farmers in the state, and they said to the farmers, look, if you guys flood your farm fields earlier than you normally would, that would help the birds. It would provide habitat for them while they're migrating south. And the farmers, you know what? Water costs money. California doesn't always have a lot of water. It's probably not the best idea. We'd like to help, but maybe not. TNC then said, okay, what if we paid you for the water? Because we understand that you have to pay for this, and it would add to your costs if you did this. So the farmers thought about it again, and guess what? They went for it. TNC pays the farmers to flood their fields early, prior to planting, early in the spring and that. And so when these birds are migrating, they now have somewhere in the neighborhood of 60,000 additional acres where they can come down. They have temporary habitat, and they're safe. They have a place to bed down, to forage for food and that sort of thing. So it's a win for the birds. The birds are happy. TNC is happy because they're meeting their organizational goals. They're helping to protect wildlife as they migrate. They're meeting their donors' expectations of what they're doing. And now the farmers are happy because they're getting paid for the water that they're using, so it doesn't impact on their economics. So it's a win-win-win in this case. And then as they were doing this, they found out after a few years that rice yields on the fields that they were doing this early flooding in were actually starting to increase, because the rice stover, the leftover stalks from the rice, and that were actually decomposing faster in the moister ground than they would in dry ground. And also the fact that the birds are coming in and doing what birds do when they're finished eating, defecating in the water, served as a type of fertilizer. And also they're tearing up the ground as they're searching for food and that sort of thing. They're finding that overall rice yields on these fields are going up. So it's a win-win-win-win. And not a single government mandate required this. No government oversight. This is totally a privately run, privately operated program. Quite effective, good for the birds, good for the farmers, good for TNC. So one example, again, these sorts of things don't have to come from government mandates, and they can be even more effective often because they're able to switch and pivot a lot quicker than our government programs. So moving on, the second principle of sound environmental policy is that property rights are the most basic of human rights, and they're an essential foundation for environmental stewardship. And this repeats one of Larry Reed's 7 principles, very close to it, but the reality is that property is an asset. You have an incentive to protect the things that you own, to take care of them. I don't know how many people in the room have heard the term drive it like a rental. The people that use rental cars have heard that. So there's a reason for sayings like that, because you don't have to do the repairs on that rental car. You don't have to take care of it in the way that you would your own car. Oftentimes, I'm not one of them, but oftentimes people drive their rental cars in a different fashion than they do their other cars. I drive both fast. So, but again, you have an incentive to protect what you own. There's an example from Pope Leo XIII. He said in 1878 that people always work harder and more readily when they work on that which belongs to them. It's purely undeniable that when a person engages in remunerative work, the impelling reason and the motive of that work is to obtain property and to thereafter hold it as their own. You do things like that. You buy a piece of property, you put your effort into it because it's yours. You want to own it, you want to manage it, you want to make sure it's taken care of. We have examples in conservation of this exact thing. So I don't know how many of you have been here, but the Averill Preserve, which is on Saginaw Road going out in between Midland and Sanford is a perfect example of this. There's a local Midland-based conservancy called Little Forks that purchases land privately and protects it. Becomes almost like a county or a state park. Offers public access to the area so people can recreate in a relatively natural area, and it also gives them an opportunity in some spots to see things like the logging history of the area, so interpretive displays and that sort of thing. It's run by a private company. There's no government money for this. It's privately owned, donated, or purchased land that's managed in much the same way a state or a county park is managed. So it provides private benefits for the conservancy because they can show their benefactors, look, this is what we're doing with the money or the land that you gave us, and also provides a public benefit because you as people are allowed to go recreate there and enjoy yourselves in the great outdoors. So moving on, number 3. The third point or the third principle is that competition and voluntary cooperation fosters innovation and wise use of natural resources. And so free markets, as I'm sure you guys have all heard in your economics courses, encourage efficient and innovative uses of raw materials. And so the picture here, a pile of plastic pellets, is something that's put together by a company called NEC. This product is NE-Cycle that they have created, and it uses a mix of standard ingredients, petroleum products to make plastics, but also about half of it is biomass that would otherwise be just discarded in the form of straw or wood waste. And so this company has created this plastic. It has characteristics that are very similar. It can be used for injection molding, just like other plastics. And it has the same handling, the same features pretty much. And what it does do is, how many people here have heard about the problem with plastic waste? Right, pretty much everybody has heard the plastic wastes and microplastics and that sort of thing, especially as it relates to plastics in water sources in the ocean. Okay, they've designed this plastic because of the biomass in it to actually, in either soil or water out in nature, this plastic will break down in under 4 years. So again, it has many of the same sort of characteristics as any other plastic, but outside in the ground or in the water, it'll break down in 4 years. So they've been incentivized by public pressures and competitive pressures and that sort of thing to come up with a plastic that addresses one of the big problems that people are facing when they use plastics. So this incentive is that they will create less expensive, more useful products that can reduce overall environmental impacts at the same time as they meet the basic needs that we expect from the original products. So again, this is competition fosters this innovation and wise use. Another example is a product called Sense. So this, you can see in the picture, essentially this little red box goes into your breaker box in your house where the electricity feeds in from the utility and all of the breakers are in your home. You plug it in, and what it does is it literally second by second monitors your electricity use in your house. So you can see this is the March report for my house. So on average, if you open up your phone, they've got an app, so you just look at your phone. At any second, on average, I was using 895 watts of electricity in my house. So I can, as an environmental type, I can brag, look at that, I'm lower than 71% of all other Sense users in the state of Michigan, on average. So you're incentivized. Look, it's kind of a little competition that you can do with yourself. Look, I'm doing better than most everybody in the state. For the month of March, my house used a total of 670 kilowatt hours of electricity. So again, lower than the average. Most use over 700. The things that I always have on, 101 watts all the time flowing in my house. So top movers for March, my furnace dropped by 27 kilowatt hours total use for the month of March, which makes sense because it was getting warmer. It wasn't as cold as it was in February and January. So I'm using less electricity. I can track moment by moment. And what it looks like when you open the app on your phone is it tells you, look, you're using, my freezer was on when I turned on the app. Heat 8, the AI, the artificial intelligence that runs the program, had not yet figured out what heat 8 is. It's probably like a tea kettle or something like that. But the AI has not yet figured out exactly what that is. Other and always on are examples, but for example, right there, my freezer was turned on, keeping the food cold. At that time, I was using 691 watts and I was spending 11 cents an hour on electricity. So this sort of innovative technology allows you as a user to say, maybe I don't want to spend 11 cents an hour. Maybe I want to spend 5 cents an hour. What things in my house could I shut off and still be comfortable, still be able to live my life in a way that uses less electricity but still allows me to be happy in my existence? This sort of technology comes about not as a result of a government program, but because an innovative private company came up with an idea to help people control their electricity use. Moving on, number 4, efficiency is the key to reducing environmental impacts. So things like, to help you make you more efficient, are things like that Sense program. Being able to do that, and as I said in another previous principle, is that willingly adopted has to be done, because you'll know that Sense is something that I put into my own house. I paid the electrician to come in and wire it into my house and chose to do that. That's a very different thing than the state government telling you, we're going to get some percentage. In Michigan's case, it's 15% of our electricity from renewable energy. In that case, the government is selecting, and we'll discuss this here in a second, is selecting a product and saying, this is the best way to do it. That is not efficient. That's central planning. Okay? It's very different for me to install Sense in my house than it is for the utility to tell me, Consumers Energy in our situation, we're going to impose summer peak rates on you, so you're spending more money between June and October, between 2 and 7 p.m., which is what we're doing here in Consumers Energy's territory. You're going to spend 150% of the normal rate to change your electricity rates. And again, that is what they're doing right now. Between June and October, in the hours of 2 to 7 p.m., electricity prices go to 15 cents about a kilowatt hour compared to 10 cents normally. So those are, again, forms of central planning that's imposed on you. And another example of that is if we compare the use of light bulbs. Back in the day, when I was younger, we used to use traditional incandescent bulbs. That was the norm for us. And they did the job, but as you can see, based on the numbers from Department of Energy here, they weren't as efficient as some of the other options, okay? About $5 a year to run a 60-watt traditional incandescent bulb 2 hours a day, every day. And that bulb would last around 1,000 hours on average. We came up with other ways, energy-saving incandescents, but the government decided, no, the efficient way that we're going to promote is compact fluorescent bulbs. And so they chose that. They started to incentivize the use of that. Utilities would charge you extra on your monthly bill to then do programs. They're still doing this with LEDs, but they would then come into your home and switch out the bulbs, old traditional incandescent bulbs, for CFLs. And so the government programs basically selected CFLs as the winner. And in doing that, what they did is they actually slowed the introduction of LEDs. If you look at the numbers on the chart, you see that while CFL bulbs use less electricity and last longer than incandescent bulbs, LEDs are significantly better in terms of overall bulb life. They last more than double the length of CFL bulbs, and also they cost about 20% less than CFL bulbs. So if government had not selected CFL bulbs as the winner, then we might have moved faster to LEDs. But again, they incentivized the use of certain technologies. And then even one of the side benefits of using CFLs was that if you happen to drop it in your house, the EPA told you that you created a mini toxic waste setting because of the mercury in the bulbs. And so, again, government selected a winner without really stopping to see maybe markets would be a better way of deciding this. So I'm sure you guys have all read Thomas Sowell before. In his book, Basic Economics, he describes this far better than I can. But one of the things that happens when you use more efficient technologies is you tend to use them more. So if you have a car that you're driving, you switch out your old, 1980s beater for a hybrid, say you buy a Prius or something like that. Suddenly you're paying a lot less for gas. You will tend to drive more than you did before. Environmental theorists and scientists call that the rebound effect. And they typically view that as being a negative. But if you read Sowell, Sowell says actually quite the opposite. It's not wasteful to increase one's use of resources that have become more abundant. They've become more abundant because innovation, technologies have improved them and made them more efficient. So Sowell continues, that increased use is precisely what is supposed to happen in a price-coordinated economy, because that is the most efficient behavior. We hear this term efficiency bandied about all the time. These utilities are telling us that they're promoting efficiency by doing time of day and peak rate hours and that sort of thing. That's making you more efficient. But Sowell pushes back against this and says, no, efficiency is finding the most effective way of satisfying people's desires. That's efficiency voluntarily chosen, not by government diktat or by central planning fiat or something like that. You are more efficient when you choose to be more efficient, not when the government tells you you have to be. So again, there's a difference between efficiency and central planning. Moving on then. Number 5, harming prosperity harms the environment. Short version, TLDR, rich is greener. And as an example, something called the environmental Kuznets curve that explains this. If you graph the stages of economic development, income per capita against pollution or environmental degradation, what you find is that in very early pre-industrial economies, Stone Age kind of things, you find that there's extremely low levels of environmental degradation, very low levels of pollution. That's simply because there's not very many people and they don't use a lot of technology. So if you think of the like pre-contact indigenous cultures, that sort of thing, picture that. They don't tend to have very big impact on the natural environment. It's because there's not very many people. But as people move forward, as we did, most human civilization has done, we begin to start using new technologies in terms of the Industrial Revolution. We began using fossil fuels, coal, that sort of thing. We used whale oil to light our homes and that. As you start to climb that technological advance, then you start to also increase your populations. As you do that, initially you will cause more environmental degradation. Pretty much the only way you escape that is by technology sharing. So a more advanced country, for example, can come into a developing country and give them new technologies that are more green, clean, environmentally friendly. But if you follow the traditional curve, as you start to increase your technology and population, you will have a larger impact on the natural environment. Then at some point you reach what is called here in this Kuznets curve, a turning point, where you go from living basically hand to mouth, where in like hunter-gatherer cultures, you don't tend to be able to plan, well, I'm going to put money into my 401k and I'm going to look out 50 years out into the future. You don't really have that option in many developing cultures or that sort of thing. So as you begin to reach that inflection point or the turning point, which this research has said globally is around $4,000 to $8,000 per capita GDP. Once you reach that point, you have sufficient amounts of money to be able to say, okay, I'm not only worried about whether I'm going to eat tonight or whether my kids are going to freeze tonight. I can start to look out to next year or 5 years out. I can begin to make those choices on a longer term basis. And so what happens then is you get that inflection, that turning point where your environmental impacts begin to go down. And so as you move into post-industrial service economies and that sort of thing, then what you see is increasing wealth, increasing regulation, those sorts of things allows countries to basically become much more green and much more clean. So if you look at, I'll just show one example here of forest cover across the planet. If you look at the areas that are green or darker green, they tend to be more developed nations with more advanced or richer economies. Doesn't mean that only the extremely wealthy have a lot of forest cover, but it's just one example. So if you look at the areas that tend to have the least amount of forest cover, there's a reason for that, because people in sub-Saharan Africa specifically is one of the most heavily deforested regions on the planet. And a lot of people, when they hear that, they'll think, well, that's because big forest companies are pushing in and they're raping the land, right? That would be the first expectation. But the reality is that the people that live in those areas don't have access to a thermostat on their wall. They tend to have to do things like these ladies here. They have to go out and find biomass. In this case, these ladies are able to collect wood. This is exactly how the deforestation happens. People trying to stay alive go out and cut down trees because they need to, today, cook their food or keep their families warm. This is how they heat their homes and cook their food. In other examples, a lot of people have to literally go behind cows and pick up what the cows leave behind and cook their food and heat their homes with cow droppings. So they don't have access to a coal plant or a natural gas turbine or any of those sorts of nuclear plants, any of those where they can just say, okay, well, I'm cold, I'm going to turn on a natural gas fire. They can't do that, so they have to collect the wood. And this is exactly why in these areas, like I said, in sub-Saharan Central Africa, they have some of the heaviest rates of deforestation. So one of my colleagues, when I worked in the energy industry, used a picture similar to this, and he said, this is the developing world's version of a transmission line. So if you go outside and you look, you can see our transmission lines shuttling electricity back and forth. What they're doing is they're moving energy for us. We then can take and use that energy to live our lives, to show pictures like this, to turn the lights on, to heat our homes and to cook our foods. But many people around the world don't have this. So they have to use other options. That, again, is their version of a transmission line. So we continue. Top-down approaches rarely work. So I've already talked about government mandates and that sort of thing. When government mandates come in, a lot of the time what you see is you get resistance. And so we've done some work. This is another video which I can't show, but if you look on the Mackinac Center's YouTube channel, this video is here. It talks about collaborative forest management, which is work that I do. And so I'll skip past the video, but I'll show you pictures of two of the reports that I've published on forest management. I'm working currently right now, just got back from North Carolina, doing another fellowship on North Carolina's forest management. And what we found is that when you have government dictates coming in the federal government deciding on national forests, we are going to manage forests in this way. What often happens is what happened in the first report. This was the first report, Conflict to Cooperation, looked at forest management in the state of Michigan. And the conflict to cooperation is exactly that. When forest managers told private property owners, this is how you're going to manage your land, there was a lot of this going on, headbutting and conflict. And so what I wrote about was, what is a way that could potentially help make those conflicts go away? Well, how can we make this easier so that the forests get managed properly, so they're not dealing with things like, as I noted here, disease and wildfire? How many of you out there see every summer the headlines about massive wildfires burning through Oregon, California, Wyoming, all of these areas? Okay, Michigan doesn't have as much problem with wildfire just because it's a much wetter state, but we have other issues. We do have wildfires. We have insect and disease issues. So our forests management is still critical in that regard. There are things out there, options that exist, like land swaps, so that the federal government can trade land with private landowners so that it's not broken up and difficult to manage. You can do things like there's programs called the Good Neighbor Authority or shared stewardship programs that the federal government has put in place. Good Neighbor Authority basically allows federal forest managers to work with state forest managers. State forest managers tend to have more dollars in their budget and also more people on the ground. So the state forest managers can liaise with private individuals, private companies. So those private companies can help the federal forest managers manage the forest in terms of doing things like spacing and thinning and road building and that sort of thing. Things that are designed to decrease the risk of wildfire on the ground, decrease disease, pest infestations, and then also provide things like jobs and road building and that sort of thing. So in the end, what you end up with is collaborative efforts to make sure your forests are more healthy and better protected from problems like wildfire and disease. And so we did this. The other publication that I did with Goldwater Institute on Arizona's forest was looking at another collaborative management technique where literally you get everybody in the room who's interested in the term stakeholders, all of the stakeholders sitting around a table and talking about, okay, what are we wanting to do with these forests? In Arizona's case, they were having wildfire problems because the forests were getting overgrown and tangled. It's called heavy fuel loading that they were dealing with, where all the small trees were growing up in under the bigger trees, shrub, brush, grass, and all that sort of thing was coming in. And it was difficult for animals to move through the area. It was starting to impact on water quality because the water didn't move through properly. And even more, it was causing risk of wildfire, which could destroy the forests, impact homes and settlements and that kind of thing around the forest. And then once a big heavy fire goes through, water quality is even worse because you get a lot of siltation. When all the vegetation is burned away, all that's left is just dirt, essentially. And it washes down into the rivers, and the city of Phoenix gets a lot of its water from these federal forests. So the watersheds exist in these forests. And so everybody started to recognize this is a problem. These wildfires are causing a problem. So again, they got in all of these groups: federal forest managers, state managers, the forest industry, environmental groups, wildlife groups, outdoor recreation, community groups, you name it. There was a list of over 40 different groups that came and took part in what was called the Forest Restoration Initiative, or FORFRI. And these groups basically hashed it out over a period of several years. And doing this allowed them to get through the process called NEPA, the National Environmental Protection Act, federal legislation that you have to get through and do environmental impact studies and that sort of thing before you can begin doing activities like harvesting in a national forest. So they were able to get through that. And because they had hammered out all the details prior to actually starting any sort of activity, there was almost nothing in the way of litigation. So I'll talk about this a little bit more in another slide, but essentially, if the federal forest managers had just said, no, we're just going to do this. We're the manager, we have the badge, this is what's going to happen. Then immediately after they put their plan in place, there would be litigation. Different groups, environmental groups, community groups, other special interests would all start and go, no, we don't want that to happen. That has historically been the pattern, well, at least over the past 50 plus years, has been the pattern with forest management. What happens is the litigation starts, everything else stops. So this program, Fry program, and other collaborative measures like it actually made it possible to start to manage these. So some of the other problems that come from mandating, and I'll discuss this one more in my presentation this afternoon on energy management. But when the government comes in and mandates green energy, what happens a lot of the time is we just end up offshoring the environmental impacts of developing those green technologies. This is a picture of Batao, China, and that flat, dead, toxic waste area that you see in the picture is what was created as a result of refining rare earth minerals. So we need those rare earth minerals to do things like put the magnets in the wind turbines that we use. So we can say in North America, we think we're doing extremely well because we're using wind and solar. But elsewhere on the planet, this is what happens oftentimes. And again, I'll speak more to this in my presentation on energy than I will in this one. But we just end up offshoring some of the environmental impacts. So we can reasonably question whether we are being all that green. Because nobody, I'm sure, in this room, certainly none of the special interest groups that protest against mining and other options in North America would allow this sort of thing to happen in North America. But that's what we do when we mandate some technologies. Another example of collaborative management is something called Paso Pacifico, where the management of endangered species, in this case specifically sea turtles, caused government officials to just mandate these turtles are off limits. You are not allowed to touch them, to manage them, to go near them, or any of that sort of thing. But what happened was several indigenous cultures in Central America actually make constant use of sea turtles. So what it did is it basically said, look, we've got the badge, we know the right answer. You people that have used turtles in this way for millennia, you're wrong, you don't get to do it anymore. So instead, what this group Paso Pacifico did is they said, no. Let's actually go talk to the people that are impacted by this, the regulations that are being put in place. And let's figure out what they need. And they started to recognize many communities rely on these turtles. Traditional uses of these turtles, as I said, have been going on for thousands of years. Is there some way that we can work with these communities to help them so that they can still do the things they have always done, but in a way that still allows us to manage and protect threatened and endangered species? What they figured out is that, yes, you can actually make use in traditional ways of some species of the turtles, the ones that are not endangered and threatened, and then actually, in a way, hire and deputize many of these communities to protect the threatened and endangered turtles. And so what they did is basically they set up programs to allow these people to manage. So you see one fellow here collecting sea turtle eggs so that they can breed those eggs and release them more successfully than if just left to natural means. So it was another way to collaboratively work with these people instead of just mandating, here's your new lifestyle. It was allowing them to take part in the discussion. Okay, and last, but certainly not least, technological innovation is key to improving the environment. And I've discussed some of this already in things like the environmental Kuznets curve. But a lot of our environmental policies, we're getting better at this, but still a lot of environmental policies are stuck in the 70s. This kind of political environmental mindset that it relies on confrontation. As I just discussed with the Paso Pacifico thing, the confrontation is you don't get to do what you want to do because I don't think you should. So I want to hunt in an area, but you want to camp. Okay, well, you go and talk to the government regulators and you say, this has got to stop. He doesn't get to hunt here because I'm trying to camp here. So there's that very kind of litigious regulatory sort of method of hampering and stalling out other ideas. And that has been that for the past 50 plus years, that's been our way of dealing with things. Just we're often stuck in the past. But again, innovation is the key to improving. So just take one example of innovation as a way to improve environmental outcomes is just look at how we take and share pictures now. Pretty much everybody nowadays takes pictures with their phone and shares them online, right? What would it look like if we were still stuck in the 70s and 80s doing those sorts of activities? How would our resource use change? So examples from my own childhood. How many people actually here even know what that thing is? Right here. What is it? A slide projector, right. So I'm showing slides here right now. It's a very different form of slide projector, but we used to go and sit in a room and you would click the button and you'd hear this like that. And it would go dark for a second and then shine the light through, and you get to watch your pictures on the wall. Ooh, it's very exciting. We would take pictures also with these other technologies. You take a picture, push the button, and the camera whirs, and out pops this little piece of celluloid. You'd wait, you'd shake it like this. You wait about, what was it? It was like 15 seconds to a minute, and then like the coolest technology, you could peel a black and white photo off of this plastic thing because you had your picture, right? So technology. Okay, that has changed even within my life. So now we go to things like Insta and others, TikTok and all of those. We share not only pictures, but movies, and we share them across the planet instantly. So technology has changed the way we carry out these activities. It's much more innovative, much more useful, and in a lot of ways, much less resource intensive. Same sort of thing. I can remember wearing those kind of shorts when I was a kid. I also actually used reel-to-reel tape players. Again, in the 80s, man, that Walkman was the coolest thing. It was like we go out on your roller skates. Look at these people. Look how happy they are. Roller skating, sharing a Walkman. And when you got tired of one song, you could press stop on the thing and press rewind and wait while the tape would go like zzz, 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 like that. And then you could click the eject button and pull your tape out and put in another tape, put it in. You could listen to a whole different album. Compare that to today, we can go on to Spotify, Pandora, Apple Music, and immediately, boom, right now, download any of millions of songs. We don't have to switch the tape out. We don't have to rewind to the end because, well, it might damage the tape in the middle of my favorite song if I leave it somewhere. We've got immediate access to millions of different options, far more innovative, far more less resource intensive. So these are the ways that we can use technology to improve our lives. So those are the 7 principles of sound environmental policy. Again, you're welcome to pick up the publication out on the back table there, and then that's how you can get in touch with me if you want. And I believe right now we're open for questions, comments, that sort of thing. And also, don't forget, even more exciting is the energy discussion today at 1. So, yeah.
I was surprised by one thing you said, so I'm not sure if I misunderstood you or if I disagree with you.
Okay.
So talking about things like the rebound effect
yes.
and, let's say, for example, peak electricity pricing. typically what I would say is, if assuming either A, something can't be privatized, or B, it won't be privatized for whatever reason. So let's say, let's say we need some sort of, let's say, gasoline, mileage standard, or, we have to have a public, utility electricity company. You can't, one way or another, the government's going to do something,
right,
for whatever reason. Typically, what I'd say is it's better if, instead of saying, let's say, for example, you must improve the fuel economy of your car, so you must have corporate average fuel economy,
right,
or you must stop using a certain electricity during the day. So during these hours, you must stop charging things.
right.
Instead, if we say, look, let's say tax the gasoline more, or let's tax the automobile emissions, or let's increase the price of the electricity. Now you're free to use whatever you want. You're free to drive your car as much as you want, use electricity as much as you want, but now at least we're sending you a signal. Use less of it if you can.
Correct.
But I'm not sure if you disagree with that, or if I just misunderstood you. Or
in terms of typically what's suggested in terms of controlling electricity use or diminishing the use of energy is a carbon tax. That's typically what comes up. I disagree with the carbon tax because the people that get hit hardest by the carbon tax are the ones that can afford it the least. So if you're making $100,000, $150,000 a year and your electric bill goes up by $10 a month, $20 a month, probably not going to impact your lifestyle that much. But if you're a single mom working 2 jobs, bringing in $20,000, $30,000 a year, your electric bill goes up by $20 a month, it starts eating heavily into the things that you can and can't do. So there's a term that gets thrown around a lot, energy poverty. The people cannot afford to pay for the energy that they need to keep themselves alive, to keep themselves warm. And there are examples in the UK that the government there actually monitors it. It's something that I think if we're going to monitor statistics, we should be monitoring something like this in North America. But they actually have a statistic called early death, where people, especially seniors, but they call them pensioners, pass sooner than they would normally in a lot of cases because they can't afford to heat their homes. They're exposed to chronic cold conditions. And in many cases, there are literally stories of pensioners in the UK purchasing bus passes so that they can ride public transit to stay warm during the day. They're not necessarily going to a job or any of that kind of thing. They're trying to stay warm. They can't. Many times what they're doing is closing off portions of their home. They live in a single room because they can't afford to heat because electricity prices have gone up so much. Putting a carbon tax on top of that would only make that matter worse. Now, a lot of people go, oh, well, we have programs in Michigan like MEAP, the Michigan Energy Assistance Program, or LIHEAP, the Limited Income Heat and Energy Assistance Program. Okay, we do have that, but it does not take away from the fact that you're then making electricity more expensive for everybody else. Now, it's a public choice thing, like Gordon Tullock wrote about this. The way they diminish this pain is they spread it out amongst many users. So every one of us pays $1 to $2 a month on our utility bills to cover these programs. And so there is a concentrated benefit, diffuse costs situation that happens. But in the big picture, it generally makes overall use of dollars and the money that you earn less efficient because you probably would have used those dollars for something different that might have helped. And in a lot of ways, this is similar to Bastiat talking about the broken window fallacy. You would have the seen and unseen actually is a better example from Bastiat. But the things that you would have spent the money on could have actually done more. Like you may have, instead of paying a glazier to fix a broken window, you would have gone and purchased, I don't know, a new pair of shoes or something like that. And in doing that, you would have provided employment for someone else. And so you lose a significant portion of the purchasing power of the dollars that you would have spent because they have to go through the intermediary step of government. So you just have the process of government being funded for the sake of funding government programs like CO2 taxes and that sort of thing. But again, at the end of the day, the people that are impacted most by those sorts of expenses are the people who can least afford to do it. So hopefully that answers the question. Yep.
We talk a lot about like licenses and like government interactions, like kind of interfering with like the public or like the private marketplace, so to speak. I've been fishing my entire life. I don't have a fishing license. But and that's kind of always just like I just refuse to get one because I don't really see the point in it. But I just didn't know like your perspective on those kind of like hunting and fishing license for like in terms of environmental like conservatism and like, things like that.
Hunting and fishing licenses is one of those situations where, like the previous question said, government exists and it's not going away. So in that regard, the system that we live in has government as the manager. The people, the state owns the wildlife resource. And we've appointed government as the manager of that. Now, for myself, I purchase hunting licenses, fishing licenses, because I know that those license dollars actually go to programs like improving habitat and management. So for myself, I do purchase them because, again, we live in the system, so in a sense, we've chosen the system. That's probably the least libertarian thing you'll ever hear me say. But again, we're in that system, and the dollars in that case specifically go toward habitat management and actually making sure that the wildlife resource is maintained and protected. So for myself, I pay for them. And, well, yeah, I don't particularly like a lot of other licenses. The work that my colleagues at the Mackinac Center do pushes back heavily against licensing. Like one example that immediately comes to mind is just last week there was a lady who I think she's in Grand Rapids who had to turn away customers. She's a hair braider, and she's not allowed to braid somebody's hair if it's not clean. But she's not allowed to wash their hair unless she gets a license and takes a certain number of hours of training. So she said, I can't afford to do the training. That's not really my thing. Like, I don't want to be a hairdresser. I don't want to be a licensed hairdresser. I braid hair. So she has not gotten the government license, and as a result, she has to turn away customers because she's not licensed, so she's not allowed to put shampoo in somebody's hair and rinse it out. So those kind of licenses, we definitely push back against and say, this is insane. It doesn't make any sense because you're destroying that woman's ability to make a living for no real benefit. So those kind of licenses we definitely push back against. Yep.
I have a comment first, and I'm hoping you'll elaborate on it and maybe provide some examples from your own political experience. But we've had a lot of speakers talk about the importance of incentives this weekend, and you certainly did this morning. And in my view of the history of environmental stewardship, I think there was a period when business had very little incentive to conserve natural resources. They were making use of stuff, and they were not paying for it. It had no owner. They use it freely, and I think they overused it and overexploited it. And we rightly said, well, they're using something they didn't pay for.
Right.
Now I think we are in a different period where instead of a market failure, we have a political failure, where environmentalists will get something they value, and yet they pay no price for it. They are using the political process to achieve whatever goals they have in terms of wildlife habitat or even blocking projects. And there's literally no cost involved in this kind of activism.
Right.
You mentioned some of the projects that you know of that have been blocked.
Yes.
So speak to that symmetry maybe between this idea of incentives on the market side and on the political side when it comes to environmental stewardship.
Yeah, exactly. The old school example of that sort of thing in an American sense is what Aldo Leopold saw way back in the day. For those who are not familiar with Aldo Leopold, he's kind of considered the father of American conservation, or one of the fathers. He wrote books like A Sand County Almanac. If you have not read that, I recommend it highly. It's an extremely quick and easy read, but rich. It's very full of information. So Leopold was a forester and a wildlife manager who, back in the early 1900s, saw some of the damage that was caused by over harvesting and that sort of thing. And a lot of us look at that and say, well, that's examples of private industry raping the land, and so we should be shutting that sort of thing down. If you look at the incentives, again, to use the term, that really drove a lot of that, the same sort of thing happened with the gold rush in California and a lot of those sorts of things. Government was a willing participant in that. Government encouraged it. They needed the wood from like the lands in Wisconsin and that sort of thing, because they had to build the train tracks and they needed the railroad ties. So they encouraged the foresters to go out and do that sort of thing. It was not only private industry that just was out there causing problems in the natural environment. It was a societal decision based in a mix of greed and ignorance that we all said, yeah, that's what we're going to do. So it was not just like, a lot of the time, again, I'll repeat it, was used as an excuse to tar industry and say, look, we need bigger government, more regulation. Government was involved in that. They were actively involved. And then other examples, look at the Soviet Union. They had some of the most strict governmental controls that you can imagine, but have some of the worst environmental outcomes because the government allowed those to happen. Having a strong government presence does not ensure that you will have a clean environment. So that first. Second, we don't have to go too far back. We only have to go a few slides back to see the examples of what happens when we incentivize certain behaviors. The only difference between what happened in Aldo Leopold's time, and over-harvesting of certain areas, and this is that's in China. We don't have to deal with it here. We offshore the damage to other countries and then sit and tell ourselves, look at how green we are. Look at how clean we are. Aren't we wonderful? Well, we expect other people to live in this. And if you read the stories about the people that live in this area, you will see it's everything you would expect from something that looks like that. The farmers and the community members and the people who lived there had all the problems you would expect: increasing rates of cancer, hair falling out, loss of teeth, ill health. Can't grow crops in that anymore because if you eat the crops, the plants suck up the heavy metals and all that sort of thing, the toxic waste that's allowed when you do this sort of thing in countries with lower environmental standards than we have. So what are you incentivizing? We pretend that we're very clean and green because we're building solar panels and wind turbines. I'll point to the picture again. Is that clean and green? Now, we all know the other sources of energy, and I'll speak to this specifically in my talk this afternoon. All sources of energy have environmental impacts. So I can't just point to this picture and say solar is bad, wind is bad. Yes, if we build coal mines, they look terrible when we're mining them. But in America, in North America, you have to reclaim that mine. And I have pictures of reclaimed coal mines that are brought back to what's called approximate original contour. So we hear stories about, well, they just dumped all the waste, all the overburden into the streams and just left it. Okay, in the past, yes, that often did happen. Today, you have to return the land to approximate original contour. You cannot just blow up a mountain and leave it. You have to actually put the overburden back in place, recreate the streams, and do all that sort of thing. That does not happen in Batao, China, does not happen in the Congo, does not happen in Venezuela. Those countries that have extremely strong government control, but very lax environmental regulation. So again, what are you incentivizing? What are you approving? It's easy, again, to look from North America and see, look, we protected the little wet spot beside our parking lot. We have a biological safety area with a sign even. Look how green we are. Or how many of you were in a hotel across the street and saw the sign that said, please help us preserve the environment. We don't need to wash your towels every day, right? Yeah, that's actually a money saver for them. It's not necessarily that they're worried about the environment. We can pretend that we're being very green and clean, but what are the actual impacts? What are we incentivizing?
I'm gonna stick on the side of incentives. So I believe there's a lot of like big corporations in America that produce product with maybe harmful like offshoring chemicals.
Yep.
What incentives could we give corporations to adopt a better environmental policy to make that not happen and still remain a profit?
The market incentives. You as a customer tell the company, this is what I want to see from you. And if you don't provide it, I'll go find another company that will. So a lot of companies are trying these things out. So they're trying to find out, and this is the innovation part that I spoke of. Companies will go, well, maybe organic food. Maybe that's the option. I want to produce, I'm a farmer. I want to set myself apart. I want to go into my own niche market and do something creative. I'll try organic, see what happens. You can, as a customer, say, yes, I think that's the best option. Hint, it's not actually. But you can say as a customer, that's what I want. You can say to GM, I don't actually want an EV because you have to move 500,000 tons of ore and overburden to create one EV battery. It's more efficient actually to use the newer internal combustion engine cars. Tell GM that. Pick any company. I mean, I have students regularly in my class, environmental policy, writing about fast fashion and stuff like that. Just the rapid turnover of, like every year you have to buy an entirely new outfit or entirely fill your closet over again. A lot of customers are saying to those companies, no, that is unacceptable. We want longer lasting, better quality clothes that overall have a lower impact on the environment. We want, domestically grown cottons or that sort of thing. So what are the options? In a lot of cases, doing stuff like that, using GMOs is the best way because you can use insect-resistant GMOs using CRISPR technologies and stuff like that to reduce overall environmental impact. Those are the best ways. But the single best way to tell a company, I don't like what you're doing, is email them, phone them, put a post on Facebook, Instagram, something like that, and say, this is unacceptable. You need to change. Far better than going to the government and saying, there ought to be a law. Customers are way more effective and also much faster. Yep.
I'm not against green energy, but it's also kind of like to the point where does it make economic, financial sense? And it's I was kind of looking into solar panels, I don't know, my sophomore year, so maybe 2 years ago. And the cost for solar panels to order to pay for your house's energy wasn't worth the cost into it. So I was just curious about the current innovation and things like that solar panels are going through to maybe make them more financially reasonable than just trying to do something good for the environment.
Yep. So my own personal take on solar panels is that they make sense in certain locations. So if you are in a remote community, for example, you live in a rural area, then it makes sense for you to have solar panels with battery backup. That, for me, that's where it makes the most sense. In terms of costs and that sort of thing, there's no escaping the fact that the cost of solar technologies has come down drastically in the past decade to 2 decades. But I'll point to the picture again. When you look at what allows that sort of cost reduction, the vast majority of the polysilicon that goes into solar panels is made in China, specifically the Xinjiang region. So if you look at what's going on in the Xinjiang region, and if you've been paying attention to energy news at all in the past year, you will know that there's been kind of an uprising within the solar industry and other areas that discusses the use of what's euphemistically termed forced labor. So for the Uyghurs, the people that are living under that system, it would probably be more accurately described as slavery. So forced labor allows for drastically reduced employee and other costs related to that. Some of the other challenges that exist with where is this stuff coming from, there are very different legal requirements in terms of intellectual property in China than there are here. So it's easy to make use of technologies in a way that would be illegal in North America or much of the Western world. So you have that also working as a means to lower costs. You have, like I noted here, far lower environmental regulations. So if you dump waste from your processes just into the backyard, not an issue. Well, in North America, you have to deal with those. So that adds costs to your process. And then China is building coal plants faster than any nation on the planet. If you take all of the construction of coal plants everywhere on the planet and match it up against what China is building more than the entire planet. So when you add it up, you're using extremely low-cost fuels, coal, that provides extremely reliable electricity, but with environmental impacts that you don't have to deal with in the same way as you do in other countries. You're allowed to use slave labor. Intellectual property laws don't apply. How difficult is it to make a cheap product compared to your competitors in the UK, Europe, Spain, North America, anywhere else? You can definitely undersell your competitors, and then throw in on top of that the fact that the Chinese government subsidizes the production of solar panels, and wow, geez, I wonder why the costs are going down. Not only that, still, to be fair, costs have gone down for production in North America because the technology is getting better, but there are more reasons why. So if you're seeing right now, you're seeing a shifting in the cost structure for solar. Right now, solar and wind are the rapid decline in prices has either ceased or has started to climb back up because of tariffs on solar panels coming from that region in China, or outright restrictions on those because of the slave labor involved in production. So the economics is shifting, and we're starting to see that happen. So it's going to change the dynamic on whether or not we're building a lot of those things. So I see Dale starting to.
We might have time for one more question. Well then,
All right.
Thank you very much, Jason.
Thank you, folks.